So this is actually a Christmas. This is called a Christmas prayer for peace, and it's from the United Church of England, our friends of the Anglican persuasion. So I offer this for us as our prayer for tonight and during this season. Um, Gracious God, we pray for peace this Christmas season as we prepare our hearts and our homes and our church to be ready for the birth of the Christ. May we remember that he is the Prince of Peace, despite of all that is happening around us. During this hectic season, oh God, guide us to take moments to be still and to know that you will work all things together, and that if we abide in you, we may have inner peace, and that we may, with great confidence, allow you to be in control of all of the hecticness and violence in the world. May we have peace in our lives and peace in our world this year. And we pray this in your son's name. Amen. Yeah. I hope that you find a little bit of peace during this time, and hopefully this time together is a peaceful time. So let's jump right into it, shall we? So we have chapter 26, 27, and 28 today. And there is a lot here because Matthew has a lot of interesting and honestly very unique parts of his passion narrative that isn't found in anywhere else in the Gospels, of the other three Gospels, and he has packed it full of interesting tidbits, and so I'm glad that we're gonna kind of dive into this. So Matthew 26 through Matthew 28:20 is Matthew's version of what's called the Passion, and it's called the Passion because from the Latin passio, which means suffered or suffering in Latin, and so that's how this portion of the gospel story sometimes gets claimed as or referred to as the Passion. And so Matthew has a pretty significant portion of his gospel, 3 full chapters dedicated to the Passion narrative. And it begins with the 4th and final Passion prediction. And Matthew is the only gospel that has a 4th Passion prediction in it. Mark, Luke, and John each have Jesus offering 3 Passion predictions. Matthew is the only one who offers a 4th Passion prediction, though it's very similar to the other 3. The Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Though as the narrative begins, the Passion narrative begins, there's no mention of resurrection this time. 3 days later, he'll rise again, though that is found in the other 3, Passion predictions. And then very, very important to Matthew is chapter 26, verse 3. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. So Matthew, more than any of the other 3 gospels, presents the high priest and the priests of the temple and the elders of the temple as the primary antagonists to Jesus during the Passion. John is the most egregious in ascribing the term that John uses is the Jew, right? And so, but Matthew doesn't say that. Matthew very much places the role of antagonists in the Passion narrative to Caiaphas to Annas to the temple priests to the scribes. Matthew gives pretty much a pass to the rank and file, everyday citizens of first century, not only Jerusalem, but of Judea, of ancient Palestine. And in even Rome, hopefully, maybe you noticed, even Rome gets a lesser role. Rome is found to be more of an accomplice to what the chief priests and the priests of the temple are trying to accomplish. And Rome's role is even diminished. And there's been some really important scholastic work around how the Gospels present Rome and how that might have been an attempt to keep the persecution of the early Christian church minimized. That the Christians can kind of go to Rome and say, listen, we don't blame you for this. Like, this is, but that being said, if you want to know more about who Pontius Pilate was, who Caiaphas and Annas was, you can do a deeper search. And they all three of them have some pretty negative reputations historically. Pilate was known as an exceptionally brutal governor of first century Palestine, very much known to do mass crucifixions, to torture and to terrorize first century Palestine. He was very much a rule with an iron fist kind of governor of ancient Palestine. So I just want you to sort of be aware of that. The depiction that we get in this gospel of Pilate is very different from the historical understanding of who Pilate was. He seems almost passive in the Passion narrative in Matthew, and historically, there was nothing passive about Pilate. You will even get to chapter 27, his fear of the riot, and so he sort of acquiesces to Jesus's death. The historic portrait of Pilate would be, he would have no problem killing one Jewish prophet, and he wouldn't fear a riot because he would just send in the centurions to crush the riots. So anyway, I point that out to you. We also now get a really chapter 26, verse 14. I will say just real quick that scene in Bethany with a woman anointing Jesus with the oil in the alabaster jar, the ointment. Who do we typically picture that being?
Mary
Say that again.
Mary Magdalene?
Magdalene, right? That's who we imagine that person being. None of the Gospels actually say that it was Magdalene who does that. We mostly imagine that because when the greatest story ever told, came out, when Jesus Christ Superstar came out, when all of these kind of sort of like cinematic versions of Jesus's life came out, they made Mary Magdalene the woman with the ointment in the alabaster jar. And now here we are in the 21st century, and we've grown up with these films, and we assume that that's what it is in the gospel, and it's not. It just says a woman. And who's the person who yells at the woman in the movies? It's always the same person who yells at Magdalene for wasting the oil. Who yells at her? It's Judas. Judas is always the one who yells at Magdalene in the movies. But it doesn't say that Judas yells at her and chastises her for being wasteful. It just says the disciples. And so so much of our understanding of what we think is in the Gospels actually comes from Hollywood and not actually what the details that we actually find in the gospel narrative, which is, trust me, that's happened forever and ever and ever. There was no greater influence on what we think is in the gospel than Milton and Dante. The Paradise Lost and the Inferno, we think of those people, those things as always. Cheryl, do you have something?
No.
Okay. So anyway, we get introduced to Judas formally.
I was thinking maybe that was why Hollywood made him the one, because right after that is.
Yeah, right, exactly. And particularly in Matthew gives a motivation for Judas's actions as greed. So it says in chapter 26:14, Judas goes to the chief priest and says, "What will you give me? What will you pay me if I betray Jesus to you?" And then they say, we'll give you 30 silver pieces, which would have been a significant sum. That's about half a year's wage. So it's a significant amount of money. And then Matthew says, from that moment on, Judas looks to betray him. The other gospels say that Satan or the devil entered Judas's heart, and really Judas was being directed by Satan or the devil to do this, and the money was already sort of out there. But Matthew doesn't have the devil or Satan entering into Judas's heart. Judas does this all on his own accord in Matthew's gospel. So that's one of the slight variations with Judas. We're also going to get another slight variation of the Judas story in Matthew, which I actually think is incredibly beautiful here in a moment. So then they start to prepare for the Passover meal. And there is, so here we have Matthew presenting Jesus yet again as sort of the new Moses. So in the original Passover, God saves the Israelites by, there's the 10 plagues, right? And the last plague is the angel of death, kills the firstborn of Egypt. It's brutal. It's a brutal story. But to pass over, right? To pass over the Israelites, they kill a lamb and they paint the mantle of the door with the blood of the lamb, right? And so so the Israelites are saved by the blood of the lamb. I mean, that's what it is. So now Jesus presents himself as that paschal lamb, as that sacrificial lamb. And so here we have him not only playing the role of Moses, but also playing the role of the lamb during the Passover meal. And here in chapter 26:26, if you look at that, while they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." And then he took up the cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." So that language has become now liturgical language for the Christian community whenever we celebrate the Eucharist, communion, the Lord's Supper, depending on what tradition you grew up in. It can be called any one of those things. The Eucharist is often high liturgical language for Catholics, Anglicans, Lutherans, Orthodox Christians. Communion is more kind of a Protestant language, the sacrament of communion. The Lord's Supper is usually lower liturgical traditions like Baptists or evangelicals. They'll call it the Lord's Supper. And and unlike Catholics who could celebrate communion or the Eucharist daily, Baptists might celebrate the Lord's Supper 4 times a year. It's you know, each tradition is different, right? And that's one of the beauties of Christianity is the breadth of the diversity of our traditions.
Where did they get it that Catholics think that it's really blood and really?
Yeah, so that's always a great question, right? That's a good question. Why do Catholics think that it's the actual, because of this? Because Jesus says, "This is my body." So
It's a symbol.
that's a
isn't it?
very Protestant way of looking at it, Cheryl. It's a symbol. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yes.
In our good Protestant minds, it is a symbol, but for the Catholics, it is, yeah, exactly. So I want you to pay attention to who's around this table. Judas is still around the table. He participates in the Last Supper. Peter, the denier, is there. All the disciples, which the Gospel of Matthew says deserts Jesus, are at there. Judas the Zealot, who is different than Judas the Iscariot, is there. Matthew, who used to be a tax collector, is there. James and John, who had just chapters before expressed their ambition and their sense of entitlement. And so you have all these different people around the table with Jesus, which I think always paints a wonderful picture for us, that we should never judge who comes to comes to the communion table when we extend the invitation, and we should never look down upon anyone who comes, because the very first Eucharistic table, the very first the first Last Supper, if you will, had a great deal of people who were flawed.
Say weren't perfect.
Weren't perfect, yes, weren't perfect. And so that's part of the beauty of that sacrament is it is literally a sacrament for those of us who aren't perfect. Look at chapter 26, verse 30. When they sang the hymn, or they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is literally exactly what it says it is. It is a hill east of Jerusalem that had olive trees. It was a grove of olive trees. And then when you get down to chapter 26, verse 36, Gethsemane translates from Hebrew into English as the olive press. So the Garden of Gethsemane is the olive press for the olive trees that are on the Mount of Olives. So it gives you a picture. I wanted to paint that picture for you. So after they celebrate the Passover, they go to this beautiful kind of vineyard kind of like setting. And then there's a part of this beautiful grove of trees that is where they actually press the olives to make the oil that then gets used in Jerusalem and by all the people. And that's where Jesus does his famous really prayer of agony, right? It's such a human prayer, like let this cup pass from me. But notice the prayer ends with the very words that Jesus told his disciples to pray. So in verse 42, Jesus, ultimately comes to a place of, but not my will, your will be done. And if you cross-reference that with the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus offers a prayer for his disciples to use, he says in that prayer, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so the prayer that Jesus uses in the Garden of Gethsemane, he uses the very words that he taught his disciples to pray way back in chapter 6. Anybody know why Judas kisses Jesus? Anybody have a guess as to why?
Wasn't he supposed to? That was how he was saying, this is him.
Right. So why would he need to why would Judas need to point out this is the guy and not that guy over there?
Didn't know.
He did, Sherry, you're exactly right. They don't know who Jesus is. They might have heard of him, but this is a pre-photograph culture and time. There's no technology to have a photograph running, or so there's not a picture of Jesus everywhere. So they don't know, they might know the name, but they don't know what he looks like. And so, and Jerusalem is a city of 100,000 people in the first century, and during the Passover festival, it could balloon to 300,000 people. So these temple guards might have never seen Jesus in person, so they don't know who it is. But there's another reason why, and it's very ironic. Matthew's passion narrative is full of irony. I'm going to point out a few ironies in it. So the traditional greeting between men in the first century in the Middle East is to kiss each other on the cheek. And so it's a sign of friendship and trust. And so when Judas kisses Jesus, ironically, he is showing that he is not being a friend, and he can't be trusted. But the first word out of Jesus's mouth once Judas kisses him is friend. Do what you're, chapter 26, verse 50. Friend, do what you are here to do. So Jesus recognizes the irony of this and calls it out, which is, a very ironic thing in terms of the narrative. And then after this episode in the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew says, chapter 26, verse 56, but all of this had taken place so the scriptures could be fulfilled, and then all of the disciples deserted him and fled. So now Jesus is on his own. So picture this. So Jesus goes from having 12 disciples to having 11 disciples to having 0 disciples. It's only him and God through the rest of this. And then on the cross, he will cry out, my God, why have you deserted me? Why have you forsaken me? So then on the cross, Jesus is 100% alone. So this really is, think about chapters earlier, he was surrounded by hundreds of people. And within weeks of that, it literally is him by himself. So Matthew does a great job of narrowing Jesus's experience down to a solitary ordeal. Yeah, right, exactly. And isn't that, again, like there's so much spiritual truth into that, like when how often we feel alone when it literally really hits. So last but certainly not least, I want to just kind of point out in chapter 26, verse 57 through 68 is the very definition of a clown court, a circus court. It is a trumped up trial with trumped up witnesses, with a trumped up verdict. And their big claim of Jesus's guilt comes in verse 64, but Jesus, then the high priest Caiaphas says to him, I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus said, you have said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tore his clothes and said, he is blasphemed. Technically, Jesus does not blaspheme. So even the big moment where Caiaphas throws a fit and he rips his clothes, and what you should know is in first century Judaism, to render one's clothes, to rip one's clothes is a sign of grief. And so Caiaphas is even his reaction is over the top, It doesn't fit the situation, and there's no indication that Caiaphas is any way, shape, or form grieving the idea that this man is about to be sentenced to death. So even that is just some show of, again, it's a circus clown court, it really is. But to blaspheme is, by Jewish law, is to use the name of God and to slander the name of God. So Jesus in no way uses or slanders the name of God in verse 64, and yet blasphemy is the very thing that ultimately gets Jesus found guilty in this trumped up circus clown court. So, and then chapter 26 ends with Peter's denial, and there's not much to say about that as far as I'm concerned, other than it's just it's just a really tragic side of Peter, and I think maybe many of us can appreciate that. So chapter 27, let's move on to chapter 27 then. So now in 26, the first chapter of the Passion, Matthew presents Jesus as the new Moses, the super Moses through the Passover meal and the Last Supper. Now we get Matthew returning to another theme of the gospel, which is Jesus is the next David, or the line of David. So Judas returns. And when Jesus is found guilty, and they take him to Pilate. And because they cannot, technically the high court, the temple court, they can't actually execute anybody. And particularly they can't execute anybody on the Sabbath and on the Passover. So that's why they take him to Pilate. So when Judas sees all of this happening, notice in chapter 27, verse 3, Matthew says, when Judas saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented. He sought forgiveness. Now, from who did he seek forgiveness from? Well, just God, because there's no one else to forgive him at that moment. And he gives back the 30 pieces of silver. This is a different account than what we get of Judas in Mark, Luke, or John. And here we have 3 times in Matthew's gospel, in the Passion narrative, someone says that Jesus is innocent. Judas says that Jesus is innocent. Pilate's wife says that Jesus is innocent, and Pilate himself says that Jesus is innocent. So 3 times people have mentioned that this is innocent blood that is about to be shed, and at no point does the high priest, does the temple priests, the religious authorities, do they relent on this course of action. So, and then ultimately Matthew says that Judas died by hanging himself. So that's the end of Judas's story. Luke and through the first chapter of Acts gives us a slightly different end to Judas's story, but you can read that. But 3 times people say that Jesus is innocent. So the second bit of irony, talked about the irony of Caiaphas ripping his clothes and everything. And the next bit of irony is the Jesus versus Barabbas episode. So it is a play on words. There is a significant play on words happening in this part of the story that I think for 21st century readers of the story really miss, because I think this is actually narrative genius. So Jesus, our Jesus, is called the Son of God. And Jesus often will refer to God as Father, and even in the garden prayer, Abba, God, like take this from me and everything like that. So we have Jesus, Son of God, or Son of the Father. Okay. Barabbas, his name translates Son of the Father. So just like Jesus's name translates God saves, Barabbas's name also translates to Son of the Father. So here we have the Son of the Father, the Son of God, standing standing next to someone whose literal name is Son of the Father. And so Pilate keeps asking the crowd, do you want me to set free Jesus, who is the Son of the Father, or do you want me to set free Jesus, who's the Son of the Father? Like, that's the play on the words that we see in Matthew. There's this piece of literary irony in this portion of the Passion narrative, which I just find incredibly brilliant. And so it's this, like I said, it's this play on words. And Matthew goes out of his way to present Pilate as this reluctant participant in this ordeal. And he only really relents when chapter 27, verse 24, when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water, washed his hands, and said, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself. And then Matthew has the crowd at Pilate's headquarters shout, his blood is on us and our children. No other gospel does the crowd shout that. But this is really one of the real unfortunate situations in Christianity over the 2,000 years of our faith, is because of these words in Matthew. The Jewish community, Jewish people have been blamed for Jesus's death, when really it was a very small group of people who really participated in this. And so we should be aware of the anti-Semitism that this particular verse has perpetuated through the centuries, and we should be better and rise above that. So I said earlier that chapter 27 presents Jesus as the next David. What I mean by that is just as Jesus is betrayed by Judas, David, you may or may not be aware that David in his lifetime was also betrayed by a fellow counselor that was in David's court. And that counselor was paid off, and that counselor ultimately committed suicide as well. And so there's this parallel between what happened to David and what happens to Jesus here. So chapter 27, verse 31, Pilate gives the sentence that Jesus will be crucified, and he turns him over to a cohort of soldiers. A cohort is an official designation of a number of how many soldiers, and so that's 600 soldiers. So when the Gospel of Matthew says that the whole cohort gathered around Jesus, that's 600 Roman soldiers mocking, beating, tormenting, scourging Jesus during this time. And in Matthew, this is just a little tidbit, it's like Jeopardy knowledge, it's not that big of a deal. In the other Gospels, they put a purple cloak on Jesus, but in Matthew, they put a scarlet cloak A scarlet cloak was the cloak that the Roman soldiers themselves would wear. So one of the soldiers takes off their cloak and puts it on Jesus in a mocking way of saying like, he's one of us, you know, kind of thing. It's a different mocking, but it's still brutal. And just real quick, if you don't know, so we often, well, most of the time we think because of what the cruciform that people wear and that you see in churches and everything like that, we think that the Romans, we often in our heads have a Roman crucifix being like a small letter T, whereas the most typical type and of crucifix that they would be like a big T. It would be a capital T, not a small t. And you can do a deeper dive if you want to on just how absolutely horrible and brutal crucifixion was. But the primary thing was that death normally came through from asphyxiation or honestly from exhaustion. Eventually the body would just not be able to lift itself anymore, that it would need to be able to breathe. We don't see our bodies rising often when we breathe because we're not thinking about it, but the body actually has to like kind of lift up to be able to breathe properly, and eventually the body would just give out. And it would take a long time. So it's a absolutely brutal thing, and it was not used commonly by Rome. And what I mean by that was it was a form of the death penalty that was reserved for the most violent of criminals, for insurrectionists, for traitors, for enemies of the state. That's who would normally be crucified. It wouldn't be some common criminal. So when it says that these two bandits, were crucified with Jesus, you have to assume that their banditry meant that they had killed a number of people in their, like, we think of bandits sometimes as like lovable, we think of Han Solo in Star Wars as a bandit, like he's a scoundrel, he's a lovable, that is not who gets crucified. People who were crucified were in ancient Rome were absolutely vicious criminals who had done horrific crimes, or they were enemies of the state or insurrectionists, traitors, terrorists. Those are the type of people.
That must be archaeologically. They really only found one example of a nail that was driven through the foot.
Yeah.
I mean, they really have not found many at all.
Right. They
Just one.
Rome, and also the idea that they would have crucified him through the hands. That's not typical.
Right.
It would have gone through the wrists.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that's about as much as I want to spend on that. It's
Well,
really
it
brutal.
makes sense though. You should only find one because it wasn't that often.
That often, right? Exactly. That's exactly right. So Jesus on the cross, his agony, his suffering, the words that he uses, the events that take place in terms of the offering of wine, to dull the pain and things of that nature. Much of that narrative is paralleled in the Old Testament in the Hebrew Bible in either Isaiah 50, which is Isaiah's account of the suffering servant, or in Psalm 22, which is a psalm of lament and a psalm of agony. And you can find a lot of the cross referencing between Isaiah's suffering servant and Psalm 22 and the experience of Jesus on the cross, including the very last words that Jesus speaks, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani is what it sounds like in Hebrew and Aramaic. Eli, lema is Hebrew, and sabachthani is Aramaic. So goes back and forth, which in his agony, you can imagine if you're bilingual that way, you might go back and forth between the languages. Of course, the people there witnessing it misinterpret him saying Eli, Eli as a cry out for Elijah. And Elijah was the figure who was supposed to bring in the messianic age. And so here they are crucifying, the Messiah, the so-called Messiah, and he's crying out for Eli. So that's another set of irony that happens in the crucifixion events. Notice the whole creation shakes with Jesus's crucifixion. It's almost as if the entirety of the creation is weeping and mourning over the events that are taking place. The day can't take it, and so the sun shields itself from the events, meaning that there's a solar eclipse. It was ironic that Caiaphas rips his clothes and everything, but now here we have the very earth kind of shaking, convulsing, and it's weeping over this. And of course we have, I've said this before, we have this very strange moment in Matthew's gospel, only found in Matthew's gospel, where the righteous are raised. And so the very first people to ever be raised in resurrection isn't Jesus. It's these people who in chapter 27, verse 52, there it is, sorry. Yeah, the tombs were opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. So you have this thing with this, but again, it's, and Matthew uses the word saints, but really in the Greek, it doesn't say saints as much. Like it's translated in English. It says the righteous ones or the holy ones. So these would have been, I don't know who it would have been, but very special people in the history of Judaism would have been the people who would have been. So then it concludes with Joseph of Arimathea, who was a follower of Jesus, a wealthy man, basically. Because of his wealth, he would have had access to Caiaphas and to Pilate, and he negotiates for the body. There's also sort of an insinuation that he might have actually been a patron of Jesus's and therefore paid for much of the ministry. I'm sure that Jesus relied on God to provide, but God provided through people like Joseph a lot over the course of Jesus's ministry. And then in chapter 27, verse 62, you get, again, this very unique episode in Matthew's Passion, which is the extra security at the tomb. So the other gospels, the stone is rolled in front of the tomb and everyone leaves. In Matthew's gospel, the stone is rolled in front of the tomb, but then the chief priests decide to station extra security at the tomb to prevent the disciples from rolling the stone away and stealing the body and saying he was risen from the dead. That was propaganda that was lobbied against the first century church all the time, that Jesus was not resurrected, but that the disciples stole the body. And the discrediting of the early Christian movement, that was a typical claim that was made, was that the disciples stole the body and then claimed that he had been resurrected. And so Matthew's sort of addressing that propaganda and saying this is where that comes from. But then, of course, chapter 28, the very last chapter. We're almost there, folks. Chapter 28, Matthew's version of the Easter event. Can you tell me one of the differences, one of the unique aspects of Matthew's version of the resurrection of Easter Day? So did anyone catch something that was very unique only to Matthew? In Matthew, do we have a witness to how the stone is rolled away? In Mark, Luke, and John, when they arrive at the tomb, the stone is already rolled back. And you get this sense that they're walking up to the tomb, they see the stone has been rolled away, and they panic, and they run to the tomb to see what happened. This time, they're going to the graveyard, just like we go to the graveyard, to pay our respects to our loved ones who have gone before us, and with no expectation that anything has happened to their funeral plot or their niche or whatever. And if we drove up and saw that something had happened, we would panic too. But in Matthew's gospel, the stone is still in place until the angel of the Lord descends, and the women witness the angel rolling the stone away. And that is very unique to Matthew. Only in Matthew do we get an actual eyewitness to how the stone is rolled away. And the angels then freeze the extra security guards, use some magic angel powers, freeze the extra security guards, and then the angel tells the women to tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee, which in chapter 28, verse 16, they meet him in Galilee. So they actually follow directions, what they're supposed to do. I also would have accepted had you said, when I said what's unique about Matthew's version of the gospel of the Easter event, I also would have accepted only 2 women came to the tomb instead of 3 or 4 women coming to it's the only gospel with only 2 women coming to the tomb. We have Mary Magdalene, and we have Mary, the mother of James, and James and John. I'm sorry, James and Joseph. So I also would have accepted that. We also have a very, very brief resurrection appearance of Jesus to the women, though he really doesn't say anything significant. He just says kind of like, "Hi there, how you doing? Good to see you. Do what the angel just reminding you to please do what the angel told you to do, which is go tell the disciples to meet me in Galilee." He doesn't really have, again, in John, we have this long back and forth with Magdalene. It's, don't hold on to me, blah, blah, blah. Matthew's version is very unique. And then we return back to that propaganda. Matthew again addresses this rumor that you keep hearing that the disciples stole the body. That rumor was planted by the chief priests. Don't believe that rumor. That's just negative propaganda against our movement. So Matthew's putting in his gospel to sort of take care of that rumor. And then last but certainly not least, it ends with what's called the Great Commission. Chapter 8, 16 verses 20, that's called the Great Commission. It's found again nowhere else but Matthew. It's a very unique ending. But it ends kind of where it began. So, there's the charge to go and baptize people, but also it speaks to sort of whereas the entire gospel has taken place in sort of the Jewish world, now that he's been resurrected, it's all the nations, it's Jew and Gentile, and so things have become more universal and more inclusive. But I actually kind of want to end at the end. Let's end at the end, which is the very last sentence of the gospel is, remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. And that is an echo back to the dream that Joseph had at the birth of of Jesus, when the angel Gabriel said to Joseph in a dream, they shall look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And so Jesus is reminding them that he is Emmanuel. He is with them always. And that is sort of a word of comfort to those first century readers of the gospel, that first century Christian community. And as we conclude the Gospel of Matthew, I hope that's a lasting final word for you today as well, that wherever you go in your life, and that God is with you always, until the end of the age. And only God knows when that will be. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts?
I just like you to take a look at Tim. He looks like an angel. His glasses on his head with a like the halo and the wings of the chair.
I always say that. He does. The wings of the chairs. That's a good look. That is a good look. I gotta say, that's a good look. Well, I appreciate y'all spending the Gospel of Matthew with me. And I hope that I hope you learned. I hope you learned something. And by learning something, it deepened your faith some. So thanks again so much for trusting me with guiding us through these stories that's found in the Gospel of Matthew. We're on break until mid-January, and then we'll do some shorter books in January and February, and take some time off for Lent in March and April, and then come back for a couple of weeks with a couple of other shorter books. So thought I might jump into the Old Testament a little bit at some point in 2025. And then in the fall of 2025, we'll do the last of the Gospels, which is Luke. We'll have gone through the entire Gospels and after 2025. So any other comments or questions? All right.
Thank you.
What my Bible says, and it says, teaching them to keep all things, whatever God commanded to you. And behold, I'm with you all until after that day, before the final end of the saints' world of this age.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a mouthful, Cheryl.
I know.
That's a mouthful for sure.
I didn't mess it up.
You did not. It was beautiful. All right, everybody, take care.
Good.
Be well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.